Um, so, right now we are in the midst of a number of interrelated and ongoing crises. We're dealing with the global pandemic, of course, which is not only ravaging our economies, but is also causing devastation to human well-being and costing lives across the globe. We have the economic fallout from the pandemic. Right now, this is really hard to quantify how big of a global fallout we're seeing right now, and it varies across countries. But
Huh?
oh, and if folks don't mind just muting themselves, that would be amazing. But it looks like we're at least in going to foresee a short, relatively deep recession, and it may even end up being at least in some countries such as the U.S., might really be witnessing potentially a depression from the current economic fallout. Jobless numbers here, for instance, range somewhere between 8 and 30 million for expected unemployment losses. To give you an idea, our unemployment numbers just came in for last week, and we had a drop. We had a rise in unemployment claims of 3.3 million. The previous worst week on record was about $650,000. To put that in 650,000 workers. To put that in perspective. So we are looking at a massive uptick in unemployed, and most economists believe that is a huge undercount for a variety of reasons. We're also dealing with two other interrelated crises right now. One is the inequality crisis. And I would certainly argue that this is quite related to the ongoing pandemic, that global inequality both exacerbates health disparities, which are leading to more spread and worse outcomes associated with the pandemic. And we're also dealing with the climate crisis. There's been a lot written recently about how the global slowdown of the economy is this interesting case study for temporary crash in emissions. I actually don't think it's this. There's a lot we can really draw from there. Nevertheless, when we're thinking about how these are all interrelated, it's important because we know that at some point we're going to have to engage in large-scale fiscal stimulus to put folks back to work. And one of the questions should be, what do we prioritize with that fiscal stimulus? And I would argue we should prioritize addressing these other crises simultaneously, namely focusing on the climate crisis, which is our most pressing social need once we get the pandemic under control. So I want to spend most of today kind of briefly going over this idea of a federal job guarantee to fight the global recession that we're facing right now. I'll try to keep my comments relatively brief so that we can have a conversation. If you have clarifying questions during the talk, feel free to put them in the chat box. Otherwise, let's hold substantive questions to the end, and we'll have plenty of time for Q&A here. So with the ongoing crisis right now, we see a range of responses from countries across the world. Some countries are opting for cash payments to individuals, kind of some form of a temporary basic income. Basic income has often been held up in competition with a job guarantee as an alternative vision for a progressive social safety net. And the idea is simply, that government should send out cash payments to all individuals in an economy. Right now, at least in the US, Congress is just finalizing a bill that will send out $1,200 to all adults, $500 to all children. However, that will end up, unfortunately, missing most immigrants and will also miss a fair amount of the least well-off in our society, particularly those that don't have bank accounts. I'm not sure what the international numbers are, but in a country like the US, roughly 10% of households do not have a bank account. And so it'll be really hard to reach those individuals with these cash payments. That said, I think we need to think about two different phases of the current economic crisis, and when we consider various responses by governments. So the first phase is, what type of economic interventions should we be considering when public health experts are telling us that we need to keep workers off the job? We need people to be staying home, and we need the vast majority of non-essential workers to go home and stay home. That's a different question from asking what is the appropriate stimulus necessary for when public health experts tell us it is safe to return to work. And the particular challenge there is that we know that the economy can't go from 0 to 100 on its own. And there's a major role for the federal government, for various federal governments to play in deficit spending in order to implement fiscal stimulus to try to kickstart economies and get folks back to work. And so I wanted to lay that out so that when we mention a few different countries' initiatives thus far, we can think about which one of those they're tailored to. So in the US, we've really been focusing on what I call economic relief rather than economic recovery. I mean, those are two distinct modes of, or two distinct phases of addressing the current crisis. Other countries, Norway and the UK, for example, have opted for different policies that will actually work to keep workers on payrolls. So companies are at least temporarily taking over payments for workers with the goal of keeping them on the firm's payroll. This has a major added benefit of not having to go through laying off workers, having many of those workers fall through the safety net and not get proper unemployment insurance, and then also the costs associated with rehiring workers, knowing full well that many firms will take this opportunity to try to lean out their workforces, which is going to reduce aggregate levels of employment across the board and cause a lot of unnecessary pain and suffering. So in terms of what role something like a job guarantee could play here, the job guarantee, I think, is not well suited for the economic relief section of stimulus. Right now, I think the best thing that government can do is indeed send cash payments to individuals, provide low interest loans to businesses to keep them afloat, and take over payroll for workers, similar to what we're seeing in Norway and the UK, in order to try to keep people on payroll. Once countries decide that it's safe to send workers back to the back on the job and to kickstart the economy again, that's when I think that a job guarantee would be particularly salient to address this crisis. So the job guarantee has a number of different functions here. By and large, what it does is it forces the federal government to become the employer of last resort. Right now, if an individual wants a job, they can go out and search for one, but unfortunately, there's not only an insufficient number of jobs, but there's importantly an insufficient number of quality jobs that pay living wages, that are unionized, and that provide reasonable benefits, particularly in more neoliberal countries like the US and UK. In those instances, we need the government to effectively put a floor in the labor market. And that's what a job guarantee essentially is. It's the government offering a public option for employment that says that if you either don't have a job or you're in a job that is of worse quality than the one that the government's offering to you, that you can leave that job or leave the unemployment line and go to an employment office. So you could just imagine, what if we turned all unemployment offices into employment offices that focused on helping communities around the world meet their most pressing social needs? This has, I think, a lot of advantages over a basic income approach for a variety of reasons. But one thing I want to mention is that giving people cash is good. Giving people quality jobs is also good. So I don't think that we need to exclusively frame these as an either or, but often, governments do face some real fiscal constraints. We do need to think about, this idea of how you pay for things. And when we talk about this idea of how you pay for things, I like to break it down into two buckets. One question is, how do we actually finance things? Where do the dollars come from? And then the second question is, where do the real resources come from? In that instance, if we're talking about childcare, where does the labor to actually take care of the children come from? Where do the facilities to actually house that come from? Things like this. But so I think that those are important questions, not to skirt, but to address head on. So one of the biggest advantages of a program like a job guarantee is that it could effectively bring us down to, it could effectively eliminate unemployment quite quickly, particularly in a major a crisis like this, where we're seeing massive upticks in unemployment, not only in the US or Norway, but across the globe, we want to try to implement programs that will get people back to work as quick as possible. So the job guarantee functions more or less as an automatic stabilizer, which is important because it will help us make sure that spending increases when the economy is in trouble, as it currently is, and that spending by the government will actually be rolled back during economic booms when firms are willing to hire workers back at wages and compensation packages that are better than what the government is offering them. Second, the job guarantee would also provide a massive workforce to start addressing our I'm going to say job guarantee a lot. Second, this provides us with this massive workforce to address what I'd argue is our most pressing social need globally, the climate crisis. It would provide us a major workforce to go about retrofitting buildings across the globe. It would provide us with a massive workforce to go about engaging in some form of a CCC program. In U.S. history, we had a program under President Roosevelt during the Great Depression called the Civilian Conservation Corps, where basically young people were hired and fed and provide a stipend to send home to go out and build our national park system, build our highways, build our railroads, so on and so forth. So you can just imagine walking outside your door, thinking about what are the needs that your community has, and wondering if the federal government paid for labor and materials for a few dozen workers just in your town, or if you live in a city for upwards of tens of thousands of workers, what are the types of needs that those workers could meet? And clearly, I think the sky's the limit here. One of the most important parts of the job guarantee, particularly in times like these, is that it helps build out the productive capacity of all of our societies. So the point of the job guarantee is to engage in socially useful work that can range from childcare services to bolstering the education system, to building out physical infrastructure like new high-speed rail, to weatherization programs for buildings to improve the livability of our homes and also to reduce emissions. But all of these things actually add to economic output. And the reason that matters is that they're not inflationary. Inflation isn't a significant concern at this time, but I do think that there are reasonable inflationary concerns if the government were to, say, provide everybody a check for $2,000 a month endlessly without countering that in some way, either with taxation or with build out of productive capacity of society. The job guarantee also really helps us provide a more equal labor market. So by providing an effective public option labor market, it effectively sets a new minimum wage. So in countries that have shockingly low minimum wages like the US, the job guarantee is one way to kind of subvert that and ensure that we eliminate shitty jobs. It also functions, I think, as a really important way to bolster labor in particular, because if labor is threatened for various reasons by their current employers, they have an unemployment option to fall back on. So it increases the reservation wage of the worker, which we know from economic research increases strike activity, increases labor action across the board, which in turn leads to better wage outcomes and higher living standards for workers. So that's a brief intro to the idea of a job guarantee. I'd love to just open it up for questions to think about how this could actually function. There are, I will say, two broadly different visions for the job guarantee. One that I, along with Professor Sandy Darity and Derek Hamilton, have developed. Our vision for the job guarantee is a little bit more top-down and centralized via a federal government, whereas an alternative vision of the job guarantee, which has really been championed by Stephanie Kelton and Pavlina Cherneva, is a bit more of a bottom-up approach to the job guarantee that's a bit more decentralized and would allow workers to, for instance, go out and work in existing NGOs, non-governmental organizations, and would simply decentralize the system much more than how we envision it. I think both have, drawbacks. I think both have advantages. But just I wanted to highlight that because there is no kind of single way you could structure a job guarantee. It's a relatively complicated. It could be a relatively complicated program that could be administered in lots of different ways. But the key to it is that the government would offer anybody a job that wants one at non-poverty wages and would pay them to do socially necessary work. This is not too far afield from Keynes's idea of, well, if we have a shortage in aggregate demand, society would literally be better off if we paid people to dig holes and fill them back in. What we're saying is, yeah, that's a great idea, but instead we should pay those people to build schools, to decarbonize our economy, to build high quality public transit and things along these lines instead, which I believe Keynes would certainly agree with. So on that note, I'll say job guarantee one more time, just to make everybody have a nice drink and open up stuff for questions. I'm excited to hear folks' thoughts on this. So feel free to type a question, or if you type out your name, I'll just call on you and you can ask your question. All right, Liv?
Yeah, I think a job guarantee is really interesting, but like you say, in Norway, for example, we have the social services creating jobs that are bullshit jobs for people, like moving rocks or filling holes, that kind of stuff. Not really encouraging people to be innovative or to do good in their society. So for me, at least, this program has to. There needs to be like a deliberative democratic process deciding what is the societal needs, and I would also argue that it needs to be, like you say, very decentralized. Like are programs sort of including citizen juries or this kind of more kind of citizen meetings to kind of find out, okay, what do we need in this community, or what do we need in this village, and then creating jobs from that? Or
so that's a great question. So I'm a little less familiar with the case in Norway, so I don't want to speak too much to that. But there are different visions. I personally envision something that's a little bit more top down in structure, and I can say a bit why I favor that. That said, I think that can be done in a democratic way that engages various forms of participatory democracy. In the US, we have a deeply racist society and history. And historically, what you see is that if decisions are left up to communities and if decisions are left up to local authorities, that you're going to entrench those existing inequalities rather than remediate them. And the program is meant to do the exact opposite. And that's why I think that we need to be careful about how we structure it. And structure it in a way to help the most disadvantaged communities out there. And that definitely poses serious challenges. That said, what we've done is we've talked about, so we have existing legislation that's been introduced by a US senator to create such a program. And the idea would be that in every community, we would have community meetings and community surveys to help communities dictate what programs they have that they would pass in their communities. In the US, though, if you totally decentralize this, you actually risk a lot of communities, particularly conservative communities, simply not taking up the program at all. So the Affordable Care Act, which is commonly known as Obamacare in the United States, which helped bolster healthcare, has more or less large aspects of it haven't been applied in many conservative states, costing thousands of US lives a year, simply because Republicans don't agree with the idea. So if we leave it decentralized, I think that we risk similar outcomes. So that's my concern. But I agree with you that is there a serious risk of creating bullshit jobs? Yes. Should we create bullshit jobs? Absolutely not. By the way, I don't know if anybody's read Bullshit Jobs. I mean, it's a brilliant idea, but it's a terrible book. I'd be curious others' takes, but I mean, it's really, I was astonished when I read it, actually. It just really lacks like some really core theory and understanding of how labor markets function, in my opinion. Anyhow, you know, so I think it's just a struggle, but I agree that we need to make sure that the projects we're doing are meaningful and are actually answerable to communities' needs and desires. All right, so it looks like we have Karen.
Thanks. I don't know the definition of bullshit jobs, but there are jobs that don't require high education and so on. When Brexit started, they all were like, get rid of the Eastern Europeans and they're stealing our jobs. So there was an initiative to take people standing in the job queue to the farms where the Eastern Europeans had been working and offering them jobs. Oh, we're not working here. And right now, Corona is doing that to Norway. So suddenly the social services office, you know, the ones dealing at the dole, need so many people that the government is saying we'll take state employees who normally work in ministries or whatever to sit and deal with the applications for the now 300,000 unemployed in Norway. You know, remember, we're a small country.
Yeah.
And also here, the farmers are saying, because of Corona, our normal workers for harvesting can't come. So please, could anyone who's not an important nurse for these days come and work on our farm? They're not having much luck on it. And it's partly because what Liv says, we have a certain security where you get money for no work and no demand. And I'm not saying everyone should be farmers tomorrow, but there's something about how do you get people to want to do things way below their competence or so on.
Yeah, so I think that's a great question. A couple things. So one, you know, I don't think that there are unskilled jobs out there, right? Different jobs require different skills. And, you know, for instance, agricultural labor is incredibly challenging work that requires very skilled hands. It's just a different subset of skills than, for instance, a professor like me has. Second, you know, one of the goals of a job guarantee is to effectively eliminate, as I said, shitty jobs, right? We want to get rid of those jobs. So at least in the US, there's a lot of debates around automating McDonald's. You know, McDonald's threatens, if you raise the minimum wage, we're going to automate a lot of our jobs. And my response to that as an economist is that is fantastic. Those are shitty jobs. Nobody should be doing those jobs. We should absolutely automate them. And the job of policymakers is to actually, not just say they will, but to actually compensate the losers and ensure that they have employment opportunities and better paying, more meaningful employment. That is a challenging job, but as the labor secretary of Sweden said, you know, the job of policymakers is not to protect jobs, it's to protect workers. Those are two distinctly different things. So in terms of the challenge right now in Norway, and we're facing a similar challenge in the US in the agricultural industry, by and large, you know, Americans or Norwegians don't want those jobs. They're low paying and they're incredibly hard physical labor. So, you know, one goal is to ensure that we can return to business as usual soon and get people and provide those jobs to agricultural workers that want them. But we should also be focused on raising the standard of those jobs as well at the same time. And then three, I think that it is reasonable to think about deploying technological advances to try to help reduce work. I'm a huge advocate of the job guarantee, but I'm also a huge advocate of reducing work hours, of automation. The key with automation is, again, how the benefits to automation are shared. Automation is how we improve living standards. It's why we don't have children working in factories anymore. But at the same time, automation can lead to massive benefits that accrue to the patent holders, or automation can provide major benefits that are actually improve everyday working people's lives, particularly the lives of workers. So it's really about policy reform to create a more egalitarian society on that front.